They didn't just ignore him. They treated him like trash, pointing him to a filthy chair beside a mop bucket while smiling suits walked past, never once asking his name. No raised voice, no threat, just dark skin, calm eyes, and the quiet decision that he didn't belong. What should have been a standard bank appointment turned into a deliberate ritual of humiliation, a layered cruelty masked as procedure, the kind that strips a man of his dignity while pretending nothing happened at all. But beneath the silence was a storm, and the man they tried to push out wasn't just another face. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Each cold glance, every skipped greeting, every locked door set the fuse for a revelation that would bring a billion-dollar institution to its knees. So before you blink, remember, the biggest twist is hiding in plain sight. Tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And when did you realize this story was about more than just a bank visit? Langston Morrow believed in order, in precision, in showing up early, speaking clearly, and never giving anyone a reason to doubt his professionalism. He had built a career out of patience and quiet strength, always careful to stay composed, never raising his voice, never flinching in the face of doubt. That morning, he had put on his darkest charcoal suit, starched and pressed until every seam stood like a crease in steel. His shirt was white, his tie navy with thin silver diagonal stripes. The leather on his shoes held a mirror finish. His briefcase, matte black with brass hinges, was firm in his hand. He checked the route twice. 38 minutes door to door, including parking. The headquarters of Wexley Federal stood in the business district like a fortress of glass and concrete. Tall pillars, broad steps, rotating doors that looked more like barriers than invitations. The kind of place that didn't just manage money, it defended it. Langston paused before entering, glanced at the building's brushed silver sign, then walked forward with even steps. Inside, the lobby gleamed. Light reflected off pale marble floors. A chandelier made of coiled crystal spiraled down from the ceiling. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. There was no scent, just filtered air and the faint breath of wealth. Langston approached the reception desk where a young man in a navy vest sat behind a glass-top counter. The receptionist barely looked up, his fingers still clicking over a keyboard. Langston introduced himself. Appointment. 9 a.m. Mr. Grayson Dale, branch manager. There was a pause. The receptionist stared at the screen. His eyes flicked over Langston once, slowly. Then he clicked again and said Mr. Dale was not yet available. Langston nodded. He was early, 3 minutes to 9. He offered to wait. The receptionist pointed toward the seating area. 2 leather chairs arranged beside a brushed steel magazine rack. Then paused, as if reconsidering. He redirected Langston to a different seat. A hard plastic chair set slightly apart from the others, next to a gray trash bin beneath a framed promotional poster for a college savings plan. Langston blinked once, slowly, then nodded again. He walked across the room and sat. Time passed. Clients entered. Some walked in confidently, phones pressed to their ears, suits looser, shoes duller. Others were escorted in by staff, with warm handshakes and even warmer smiles. A young couple in denim and sneakers were greeted before they had spoken a word. Langston remained where he was, his back straight, his briefcase still balanced on his knees. At 9:12, he approached the desk again. He asked politely if Mr. Dale was available. The receptionist replied that the manager was still in a meeting. Langston thanked him and returned to the chair. At 9:25, he stood again. This time, the receptionist didn't look up until Langston had spoken twice. He repeated his name, repeated the appointment. The receptionist asked him to wait just a moment. He picked up the phone, pressed a button, and whispered into the receiver. He turned slightly in his chair to hide his mouth, then hung up without explanation. Mr. Dale would be with him shortly. Langston returned to his seat. The angle of it made his knees cramp. He adjusted his tie, wiped a spot from the toe of his left shoe, and stared at the door marked Executive Offices. It remained closed. At 9:43, a man emerged through that door, broad-shouldered, with graying temples and a pale pink shirt, laughing at something someone had said behind him. Langston recognized him from the website photo. Grayson Dale, the branch manager. Dale walked across the lobby with his arm around another man's shoulder, chatting as if they were old friends. The other man wore cargo pants and a hoodie. They stopped in front of the teller line, exchanged a handshake, and then Dale turned around. His eyes swept across the room and landed on Langston. There was no recognition in his face. No flicker of realization. Just a glance, a pause, and then he looked away. He walked back toward the offices. Langston stood. He straightened his jacket, walked toward the receptionist, and calmly explained again that he was there to meet with Mr. Dale. The receptionist sighed, glanced toward the hallway, and tapped something again. He said the manager was now occupied and that Langston would need to reschedule. Langston asked if Dale had received his materials. The receptionist said nothing for a second too long, then responded that he wasn't sure. Langston didn't raise his voice. He only asked if someone could confirm. The receptionist said it wasn't possible at the moment. Another pause. Langston asked if he could leave his documents for review. The receptionist hesitated, then reached for a tray labeled General Inquiries. He tapped it once and told Langston to place the file there. Langston's chest fell hollow, but he opened the briefcase, slid out the proposal folder, 12 pages, graphs, charts, letters of recommendation, and placed it in the tray. As he did, 2 bank employees walked past behind him, whispering just loud enough to be heard. One of them snickered. He didn't turn to look. He walked back to the chair and sat again. The lobby was quieter now. His watch read 10:04. A few customers still lingered at the teller booths. A woman in a lavender scarf glanced at him once and then away, like she was unsure if she should feel sorry for him or not. The receptionist answered a call and began laughing, loud, unaffected. Langston's hands were stiff where they rested on the briefcase. He stared at the entrance. He couldn't move. Not yet. Now, as he stared through the windshield at the silver letters gleaming above the bank's entrance, he debated whether to return. The logical voice in his head told him to walk away, to take his dignity and place it elsewhere, but another voice, the quieter one that had guided him through years of hard-earned advancement, said no, not yet, not without being seen. 2 days later, Langston returned. The same glass facade of Wexley Federal stood unwavering in its polished indifference. The building, unmoved by the injustice it had cloaked, reflected sunlight in harsh slashes as if daring him to try again. Langston stepped forward in a slate blue suit, his steps even, briefcase firm in hand, collar freshly pressed. His reflection followed him in the mirrored exterior as he walked through the revolving doors and re-entered the world that had recently dismissed him. Inside, the lobby hummed with artificial warmth and calculated hospitality. Conversations drifted softly between clients and bankers, punctuated by laughter that echoed a little too sharply in Langston's ears. The same receptionist sat behind the desk, posture identical, eyes dulled with disinterest. Langston approached with calm purpose, repeated his name, the time, and the confirmation for a rescheduled appointment with Grayson Dale. The receptionist stared at his screen without acknowledgement, then replied with the same professional detachment, instructing him to take a seat. This time, the seat had moved. Not beside the trash bin, not next to the pamphlet rack. Now it was tucked awkwardly behind the teller line, half obscured by a tall potted plant, angled awkwardly in the direction of the employee entrance, as if someone had gone out of their way to place it far from the more comfortable leather chairs where other clients waited. Langston sat without protest. The seat creaked beneath him and tilted slightly to one side, creating a physical discomfort that echoed the emotional strain already tightening across his chest. He opened his briefcase slowly, double-checked the packet of documents resting inside, and placed his hands in his lap. Every movement was measured, every breath counted. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Clients entered, some greeted by name, some escorted in with back pats and toothy smiles. Langston watched 2 men arrive wearing jeans and polo shirts, carrying no visible documents, and still led directly into offices within minutes of their arrival. He checked the time again. 23 minutes. No movement. No one addressed him. No one looked in his direction. It was as though the potted plant beside him had become a boundary, a barrier that marked him as outside the stream of privilege and favor that flowed freely around the bank. At the 35-minute mark, the glass door leading to the executive wing opened. Grayson Dale stepped out, his voice already raised in a hearty laugh directed at a younger man in a leather jacket. They stood talking beside the teller line, just a few feet from Langston's seat, yet neither looked in his direction. Langston's name, so clearly stated at check-in, had not been spoken once. Grayson's eyes passed over Langston briefly, no more than a flicker of acknowledgement, then turned back to the conversation. Langston stood. He walked calmly to the receptionist and asked, again, whether Mr. Dale was ready to meet. The receptionist responded that Mr. Dale had been unexpectedly pulled into another meeting and would not be available until later in the day. Langston asked if the documents could be submitted. The receptionist glanced at a tray marked General Inquiries and said they could be reviewed at a later time. Langston did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He walked slowly back to the plastic chair and sat again. Time crawled forward. An older woman in a shawl arrived and was immediately escorted into the executive hallway. A young man in a hoodie and sandals approached and was waved through after a 2-second conversation with the receptionist. Langston remained where he was. The air conditioning kicked in above him, and a thin draft blew directly against his neck, making him pull his collar higher. At one point, a toddler wandered close to him, staring with wide eyes. The child's mother swooped in, lifted the child, and offered Langston a forced, tight-lipped smile that vanished before it reached her eyes. Langston didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest. 51 minutes had passed. Then Grayson Dale returned, this time alone. He stepped to the center of the lobby and raised his voice without warning, declaring that Mr. Morrow's appointment must have been a mistake. Several heads turned. Clients paused mid-conversation. A banker near the loan desk froze. Grayson continued, saying that no such meeting had been scheduled for today, and that Mr. Morrow was likely mistaken on the date. The receptionist looked up, his face neutral. A few people began to whisper. Langston stood, stunned, unable to process the deliberate denial. Grayson smiled broadly, addressing the entire room now, and offered his apologies for the confusion. He then gestured toward the exit and said Mr. Morrow was free to leave his documents if he wished, and the bank would be in touch. Langston's body did not move at first. Every limb felt as though it had been filled with sand. His voice remained locked behind clenched teeth. He looked around the lobby and saw only averted eyes, half-turned shoulders, and the uncomfortable silence of people watching something unpleasant they hoped would end soon. He turned. He walked toward the door. He did not speak. He did not turn around. The automatic doors opened for him without resistance, and the city swallowed him again. His reflection in the window glass was somber and tired, the fine lines near his eyes now more pronounced than they had appeared just days before, and though there was no visible wound on his body, something beneath the surface ached with the heaviness of being quietly erased, made invisible in spaces where he should have been seen, heard, and treated with the basic dignity he had spent his life earning. Still, Langston returned to the bank, not because he believed it would welcome him, but because withdrawing silently would be a kind of surrender, a confirmation of the quiet message he had already received. And if he allowed that to settle into truth, then all his work, all his preparation, all the hours behind closed doors, honing proposals and building portfolios would have meant nothing. He arrived early again, as always, stepping from the car with careful control, his suit darker this time, chosen deliberately, his shoulders squared not with arrogance, but with necessity, because dignity had become a shield he could not afford to lay down. The bank loomed as before, all glass and concrete and carefully curated indifference, and inside, the rhythm of business pulsed without concern for him or his intentions. When Langston approached the receptionist, the man did not hide his boredom, his gaze skimming Langston's face as if scanning a barcode, his voice flat as he confirmed the name and gestured without a word toward the now familiar plastic chair, which this time had been relocated again, farther from the lobby, now tucked beside the water fountain near the hallway labeled staff only, An even less visible corner meant not just to contain him, but to remove him from the line of sight entirely. Langston did not protest. He walked slowly, sat in silence, and watched as other clients entered, all received with a spectrum of warmth and welcome that had never touched him. And while they were ushered forward with smiles and greetings, Langston was left with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the damp chill rising from the floor through the soles of his shoes. At 9:35, more than half an hour after his arrival, Grayson Dale passed by, not with an explanation or a welcome, but with a clipboard in hand, speaking to a junior employee about weekend golf reservations, ignoring Langston entirely, his voice loud enough to carry, but never acknowledging the man seated in silence 10 feet away. Langston stood, stepped into view, and offered a polite request to speak with the manager for just a moment, but Grayson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to his colleague, made a pointed remark about keeping things on schedule, and only then addressed Langston with a vague apology, stating that his day was booked solid, and perhaps it would be better to coordinate with the administrative assistant for future availability. There was no acknowledgement of the previous appointments, no reference to the documents submitted, no hint that any part of Langston's presence carried value. Instead, Grayson waved toward the front counter where a young assistant had just spilled a stack of paperwork, and without a backward glance, walked away to help pick it up, leaving Langston standing in the hallway, humiliated, ignored, and now visibly exposed to a small group of employees who stood nearby, pretending not to stare. Langston felt heat rise in his chest, not from anger, but from that more corrosive feeling of helplessness, the slow boil of knowing that every polite word, every proper gesture, every bit of self-restraint was being met not with respect, but with deliberate erasure, as if his existence inconvenienced the rhythm of this place more than anything else. He returned to his seat, gripped the handle of his briefcase with white knuckles, and waited. 20 minutes passed. Then another 30. Not once was he approached. Not once was he addressed. And when a group of middle-aged clients arrived, speaking loudly about mutual funds and weekend travel, they were taken in immediately, their laughter echoing off the marble walls, while Langston remained motionless in his corner, a ghost in a room full of celebration. At 11:02, one of the younger tellers walked past, paused briefly, and asked if he had been helped yet, her voice hesitant, her posture uncertain. When Langston replied that he had been waiting for over 2 hours to meet with the manager regarding a submitted investment proposal, she blinked, frowned, and said she'd check, though the phrase sounded more like an excuse than a promise. His instincts told him something deeper had taken root inside this building, something coordinated, something systemic, something that went beyond ignorance or administrative confusion and into the quiet, intentional realm of dehumanization, where a man could be stripped of identity not with insults, but with silence, not with slurs, but with indifference. That morning, Langston wore a charcoal gray wool coat over his suit, the collar pulled high against a cold wind that swept through the city like a reminder of the chill he would once again face inside that building. His fingers clutched the handle of the briefcase tighter than usual, not from anxiety, but from a need to feel anchored, to remind himself that he was still real, still present, still standing despite the efforts to make him disappear. When he entered the bank, the receptionist looked up, recognized him, and immediately glanced away without a word, his posture stiffening, his face flattening into a mask that signaled neither welcome nor hostility, only calculated non-recognition, as if Langston had become part of the furniture, something one acknowledged only by stepping around it. No words were exchanged. No instructions were given. Langston, understanding what was expected now, walked silently to the seat he had once again been assigned. Not the proper leather chairs reserved for clients with appointments, not the ordinary padded chairs near the entrance, but a solitary folding chair placed awkwardly next to the building's maintenance closet, beneath a flickering fluorescent light, surrounded by laminated posters on community loan programs and scratch tile floors that smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. As he sat, a janitor exited the maintenance door with a mop bucket, gave Langston a long, curious glance, then shook his head slightly and walked away without speaking, leaving behind a trail of wet footprints and a faint odor of ammonia that lingered in the air like a reminder of where Langston had been placed, out of sight, out of favor, and out of mind. For the next 20 minutes, Langston sat alone in that space, his back pressed against the cold wall, his hands folded neatly over his briefcase, his ears attuned to every footstep, every cough, every laugh echoing from the main lobby, where other clients were greeted by name, offered coffee, and invited into offices with open doors and smiling faces. At 9:41, a woman entered the lobby with a small designer dog nestled in her purse, her heels clicking sharply on the marble as she approached the counter, her nose wrinkling as her eyes landed on Langston, seated by the maintenance closet. She stepped slightly to the side, clutching her bag tighter, and asked the receptionist, in a tone loud enough to carry, whether it was safe to walk past that section of the building, whether someone was cleaning, or whether there had been some sort of maintenance issue. The receptionist smiled and reassured her, then looked over at Langston, expressionless, and said in a tone that was soft but firm that Mr. Morrow was just waiting. The woman raised an eyebrow, muttered something under her breath, and stepped quickly past, throwing a glance over her shoulder that made Langston's shoulders tense with something too heavy to name, a mix of shame and fury that had nowhere to go, because to respond would only confirm the image they had already constructed of him. A problem, a threat, another. At 10:02, a teller passed by with a tray of bottled water for clients seated in the main waiting area. She moved carefully from chair to chair, offering refreshments and polite conversation to each person, her voice bright and her hand steady. But when she reached the boundary between the regular seating and Langston's isolated spot, she hesitated, glanced at him, then turned and walked back toward the counter without a word, leaving him without a bottle, without acknowledgement, without presence. Langston sat still, his mouth dry, his throat tight, and wondered for the first time in his professional life whether he had become invisible not by accident, but by consensus, whether those inside this building had made a silent agreement that he was not to be engaged, not to be treated, not to be seen as a man with purpose, but as a placeholder for discomfort, a vessel onto which they could project unease without accountability. 10 minutes later, Grayson Dale emerged from his office, walking briskly with a small group of employees trailing behind him, their hands full of clipboards and tablets, their eyes fixed on the information displayed in glowing blue. As they passed Langston, Dale did not pause, did not speak, did not offer even the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Instead, he spoke loudly to his group about quarterly reports, expansion forecasts, and operational strategy, using language thick with confidence, purposefully complex, and dripping with the self-assurance of someone who had never had to question whether the world saw him as legitimate. Langston watched them walk away, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning not with tears, but with the dry sting of prolonged restraint, the pain of knowing that no matter how prepared he was, no matter how polished his presentation or how airtight his logic, none of it mattered, because he had already been cast in a role he could not escape, a role that denied him not only access, but humanity. By 10:47, Langston stood and walked once more to the front desk, where a different receptionist now sat, her eyes scanning the computer screen with mechanical precision. He asked if Mr. Dale would be available for just 5 minutes, explaining again that his materials had been submitted over a week ago and had not yet been reviewed. The receptionist glanced at him, then back at her screen, and said Mr. Dale was unavailable, then added, with a voice devoid of empathy, that she could not guarantee a time or date when he might become available again. Langston nodded, thanked her, and turned away. As he walked back toward his assigned seat, he passed a man in a blue blazer who gave him a half-smile and stepped to the side as though avoiding an obstacle. Another client nearby whispered something to her husband, and the two of them shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes darting toward Langston and then away, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him or pretend he was not part of the landscape. He returned to his seat and remained there for another 40 minutes, unmoved, uninvited, and increasingly unseen. At 11:32, a different staff member walked by and asked if he was waiting for someone in particular. Langston responded evenly, repeating the manager's name, to which the employee frowned, said he would check, and then never returned. By noon, the bank had grown quieter. He spent the next 3 days in quiet but focused motion, making calls to departments that had previously accepted his work without hesitation, contacting clerks and assistants whose names he remembered from years of projects, hoping to find even a single sympathetic voice inside the structure of that institution that would acknowledge his professional legitimacy and validate that his name, proposal, and presence had indeed once been scheduled with merit. But every email went unanswered, every voicemail was met with silence, and the few people who did answer the phone spoke in clipped tones, citing confidentiality protocols, redirecting his questions to generic customer service lines, or pretending to take messages that never produced follow-up. On the fourth day, Langston wrote a formal complaint detailing every visit, every time-stamped interaction, every name and tone and placement of his seat, attaching copies of his original appointment confirmation, his proposal, and a dated photo of a location where he had been made to sit outside the janitor's closet. But when he attempted to deliver it in person to the branch, he was intercepted at the door by a security guard who informed him that, due to unspecified internal policy, clients who did not have active accounts or pre-approved meetings were not permitted to enter beyond the reception threshold. And when Langston tried to explain that he did in fact have both an appointment history and submitted materials for review, the guard's hand hovered over the radio at his shoulder, and the message was clear: not today, not again, not here. Langston stepped back without resistance, nodded once, and walked away, but inside his chest something shifted, a flicker of something cold and focused and utterly unshaken, because this latest act was not just exclusion, it was the formal silencing of his presence, the final stage of invisibility wherein his right to be acknowledged as a contributor had been stripped and replaced by the designation of unwanted guest. And yet he knew, in that moment, that silence was a tool only if it went unrecorded. And so he began to document not just his own story, but the way the system moved. Against him, slow and quiet and precise, its cruelty not shouted but whispered, its discrimination not declared but enforced by routine. He compiled a record with exact dates, transcribed every voicemail left unanswered, captured screenshots of the auto-replies and message bounce-backs, organized every visit into a timeline that detailed not just the denials, but the environment of dismissal, how the seating placement had changed, how the staff expressions had evolved from polite detachment to visible discomfort, how the surrounding clients had begun to respond to him with sidelong glances and whispered avoidance, and how, despite his professionalism, his tone, his attire, and his preparation, the institution had systematically made it clear that he was not only not welcomed, but not worthy of the common dignity given freely to others. He met with a journalist he trusted, someone who had once profiled his work in the context of urban economic renewal, and shared his experience, not as a story of personal grievance, but as a study in modern erasure, a case where civility had been weaponized to obscure prejudice, where policies were applied selectively to produce an environment of exclusion so subtle and so consistent that it could easily be dismissed as anecdotal unless fully mapped and laid bare in a language more exacting than outrage. The journalist listened carefully, took notes, asked measured questions, and promised to follow up with inquiries to the institution, not directly through public accusations, but through formal channels requesting clarification about their appointment procedures, visitor policies, and client engagement guidelines. That same week, Langston filed a formal complaint with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, attaching his timeline, documentation, and written account, not because he expected swift justice, but because even paper silence left a trail when pressed between the right hands. He returned to Wexley Federal one final time that month, not to enter but to observe, to stand across the street and watch how others were treated, who was welcomed, who was greeted by name, who was ushered in without a glance at their clothing or their documents. And what he saw confirmed what he already knew deep in his bones, that exclusion was not about rules but about faces, not about policy but about perception, and that once marked, a man like him could be treated as invisible without anyone ever speaking his name aloud. He did not raise signs or cause scenes or shout into traffic about injustice. Instead, he recorded the times, took photos of the lobby from across the avenue, and filed every image and moment into a growing archive, a body of proof that the system did not need violence to enforce separation. It needed only consensus and silence. Days later, Langston received a message from a colleague he hadn't spoken to in months. Someone inside the financial sector who had once praised his acumen and recommended his work to investors. And this colleague sounded nervous, hesitant. choosing his words with an awkward deliberation that told Langston immediately something had changed. The colleague confessed that he had recently heard Langston's name mentioned in passing during a compliance review at another firm, attached not to any official flag, but with a quiet warning, a vague suggestion that Langston had become difficult, that he had made trouble at a major institution, that it might be best to avoid engagement until things had settled. He reviewed his complaint records every night, checking timestamps, rereading his notes, confirming that every interaction had been recorded exactly as it had occurred. But despite the precision of his documentation and the calm logic of his arguments, no response came from the bank, the regulatory agency, or the journalist who had once seemed interested in telling his story. The silence became not just an absence of reply, but a presence of dismissal, a calculated delay that carried its own message. Your voice does not matter. Your experience does not threaten us. Your suffering is yours alone. By the 10th day, Langston found it difficult to sleep for more than a few hours at a time, his thoughts looping endlessly around the same reality, that despite his professionalism, despite his restraint, despite his methodical approach to addressing the injustice, the system remained unmoved, untouched, unchanged. The consequences of being labeled difficult, of daring to resist quietly and on paper, had already begun to echo in his professional life, with canceled meetings, vague postponements, and once open doors now sealed with polite vagueness or sudden unavailability. Langston realized with a sickening clarity that the punishment for his persistence was not overt attack, but systemic erosion, a slow withdrawal of opportunity, credibility, and trust, designed to leave him isolated and discredited without a single direct accusation ever being made against him. On the 12th day, Langston stood in his apartment staring at his own reflection in the mirror, seeing not just his face, but the evidence of fatigue around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the quiet tightness in his chest that had settled there like a second skin. He adjusted his collar, pulled on his jacket, and left without fully understanding why, walking the city streets until he found himself once again in view of Wexley Federal, the familiar cold steel and reflective glass looming before him like a monument to exclusion. He did not intend to enter. He did not intend to speak. He only stood across the street and watched, noting how many clients were greeted with nods and smiles, how many were invited in with handshakes and eye contact, how often the doors opened easily for some and seemed to resist others. As he observed, a memory returned from weeks ago, the receptionist's glance, the dismissive tilt of the head, the silent agreement to place him by the janitor's closet and treat his silence not as dignity, but as confirmation that he could be mistreated without consequence. Langston clenched his fists in his pockets, not from rage, but from the realization that even now, standing outside and unseen, the bank held power over his breath, over the weight in his limbs, over the tempo of his heartbeat. That evening, Langston wrote one final letter, not to the institution, but to himself, a record of every attempt, every moment endured, every humiliation suffered, written not with the intention of fighting the bank anymore, but with the clarity that his fight had already changed shape. He no longer sought recognition or access. He now sought truth, and truth, he realized, had to live outside their walls. The next morning, Langston returned to Wexley Federal at precisely 8:45, dressed in the same charcoal gray suit he had worn on his first visit, his briefcase in hand, and stood silently near the building's entrance as staff began to arrive. He did not attempt to enter. He did not speak. He stood there like a statue, unmoving, unblinking, his presence no longer requesting approval, but asserting fact. I am here. I was here. I will not be erased. Staff passed by quickly, some pretending not to see him, others whispering as they walked, their discomfort growing with each passing minute as his presence challenged the system in a way that no letter, no complaint, no regulation ever had. At 9:10, a manager, not Dale, stepped outside and approached cautiously, asking if Langston needed assistance. Langston simply replied that he was waiting, and when asked for whom, he stated with precision that he was waiting for his dignity to be returned. The manager frowned, offered a thin smile, and returned inside, and Langston continued standing in the cold morning air. By 9:30, the bank's regional director had been alerted, a man Langston recognized from the company's public leadership page, who now stepped outside with a guarded expression and firm posture. He asked Langston to explain his presence, to clarify his intentions, to avoid disruption. Langston replied calmly that no disruption was taking place, that his presence was not a threat, and that his silence was merely a reflection of the silence that had been given to him in return for his patience and professionalism. The director asked if Langston had submitted documentation, to which Langston replied that over 4 weeks of documentation had been submitted and ignored, buried beneath the institution's curated politeness and operational barriers. A pause followed. Then the director asked if he would be willing to discuss his concerns privately. Langston declined. He said that private rooms were where his dignity had been quietly stripped and hidden, and that his truth, if it were to be heard, would be heard in the open. The director, visibly uncomfortable, returned inside, and Langston resumed his silent vigil, standing as clients entered, as staff stole glances, as the institution now found itself forced to face the man it had tried to erase. The whispers inside the bank had turned into meetings, and those meetings had turned into concerns, and those concerns had become strategy sessions on how to navigate the growing discomfort of a man who refused to move, who refused to raise his voice or hold a sign, but who made it impossible to look away by the sheer consistency of his existence in the place where he had been told, over and over, that he did not belong. On the 7th morning, a woman with gray hair and a leather satchel paused beside him on the sidewalk, looking at him with curiosity rather than pity, and after a moment of silence, she asked what he was doing there, why he stood so still in front of a building that looked down on him with mirrored eyes and sealed doors. Langston answered, not with an explanation, but with a question of his own. Had she ever been somewhere where everything about her was wrong before she spoke, before she moved, before she even breathed? The woman blinked, tilted her head, and said yes, and then she remained beside him for several minutes before walking away without another word. Later that afternoon, a young man in a delivery uniform paused to shake Langston's hand, said nothing, and returned to his route. Each day, more people noticed. Each day, more people slowed their steps. Some asked questions, others whispered theories, and a few returned with friends. Langston said little, but he began to carry with him a folder containing copies of the timeline he had created, printed on plain white paper, labeled only with dates and descriptions of each failed meeting, each redirection, each act of dismissal and exclusion endured over the previous weeks. When asked what he was protesting, he offered a sheet. When asked who he was, he offered another. His voice remained steady, his explanation brief, always ending the same way: I wanted to be seen. On the 9th day, a reporter arrived, not the one who had first spoken to him and disappeared, but another, younger, curious, and armed with questions and a camera. She asked him to repeat his story. He did, not with anger or performance, but with the precise articulation of a man who had repeated it to himself in the silence of his apartment for weeks. She asked if he would go on record. He said yes. She asked for background. He gave it. His degrees, his projects, his clean record, his client testimonials, his history with financial planning and community development, all of it documented, none of it hidden, and all of it ignored by the institution behind him the moment he walked through its doors, and they decided that he didn't belong. When the story went online 2 days later, it was quiet at first, just a local piece, buried in the community section, but it caught the attention of a blogger who specialized in corporate inequality, and from there it leapt, shared, reposted, dissected, and reframed in a dozen articles that all carried the same underlying question. How could a man so qualified, so calm, so professional be so easily erased by a system that claimed to value inclusion and fairness? Langston kept showing up. He stood each day, offered his sheets when asked, answered questions when asked, and said nothing more. But now others began to arrive beside him. One woman brought a folding chair. Another brought coffee. Someone printed his timeline and laminated it, posting it on a poster board propped against a lamppost. Wexley Federal began closing the blinds inside their glass walls. The receptionist, once so practiced in indifference, no longer sat in view. Grace and Dale had not been seen publicly since the article went live. On the 12th day, a man in a dark gray suit approached Langston on behalf of the corporate office, asking if he would be willing to meet with leadership privately to resolve the matter. Langston said no. He said the matter was not private, had never been private, and that the resolution would not take place behind closed doors where the truth could be rewritten. The man left, frowning. The crowd around Langston grew. Not large, not loud, but consistent. Curious neighbors, local students, small business owners, even a retired judge, all arriving in shifts to sit near him or listen to the story. It was not a protest in the traditional sense. There were no chants, no picket signs. But it was a reckoning, a slow and undeniable confrontation with a system that had operated in comfort, now forced to confront the human consequences of its casual cruelty. On the 15th day, Langston received an email from a national news outlet. They wanted to run a feature, a segment about silent exclusion, institutional dehumanization, and the quiet erasure of individuals through policy and practice. They asked if he would speak. He said yes. He did not hide his name. He did not protect the institution. He did not embellish the story. He told it plainly, fact by fact, moment by moment, and let the evidence speak for itself. Within 72 hours, the segment aired nationally. The story was reposted by advocacy groups, shared on forums, discussed on podcasts. Wexley Federal's parent company released a statement acknowledging that the situation was under review and that they took concerns of discrimination seriously. Bureaucratic hostility. But the silence he once held like armor was beginning to crack, not from defeat, but because the world had begun to demand his voice in full, not just his outline or his shadow, but the man behind the patience, the intellect behind the calm, the identity behind the injustice. And now, with cameras rolling and reporters waiting, it was time to reveal not only what had been done to him, but who exactly they had chosen to erase. On the morning of the press conference, Langston did not plan to speak from anger, though every reason for fury lived inside him, nor from vengeance, though he had earned the right to feel it, but instead from truth, because the power of his protest had never been in volume, but in precision, and now that the world was watching, he intended to give it the clarity it deserved. He stepped onto the small podium set up across the street from the bank, not surrounded by chants or banners, but by rows of journalists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had come to understand the weight of his stand not as a political message, but as a human one. And as he looked into the sea of faces, he saw something that had not existed 3 weeks before: recognition, not of fame, but a value. When he began speaking, the crowd fell silent, and in a voice that was even and steady, he told them his name, his background, his experience, not as a resume, but as a record of what had made him believe he would be respected in the very space that had instead decided to discard him. He spoke of his education, not to boast, but to show the absurdity of their dismissal. Degrees in economics and finance from 2 nationally respected universities. Years of experience guiding low-income families toward financial independence, multiple awards from regional business groups for ethical leadership, and documented project successes in both public and private sectors. He had been invited to conferences, consulted by state agencies, and written white papers on economic inclusion. And yet, when he stepped into Wexley Federal with a folder of investment proposals, he was met not with interest, but with silence, mockery, and removal. Not because of any failing in his work, but because the sight of him in that space triggered a reflex of rejection that no one inside felt obligated to explain. Langston told them how he had been made to wait by the trash bin, how his documents had been ignored, how his name was erased from schedules, how he had been mocked, monitored, and finally barred. And he explained that none of it was accidental, that the pattern was too precise, the cruelty too consistent, and the resistance to accountability too immediate. But more than that, he told them who he was. He told them about his grandfather, who had been denied a mortgage in the same city decades earlier for reasons never stated, about his father, who had started a small landscaping business with cash because no bank would approve his loan, and about how he, Langston, had sworn never to let invisibility become inheritance. He told them about the clients he had served, the trust he had built, the way he had believed, until recently, that credentials and character would be enough. Then he told them who else he was. He revealed that he had been the anonymous donor behind 3 major local grants to neighborhood business incubators. He explained how he had quietly seeded emergency relief funds during the pandemic for families with no access to credit. He disclosed that he had been part of a joint advisory council for financial equity and access reform, and how that council had met with Wexley federal executives the previous year under non-disclosure agreements. He pulled out a signed letter from the bank's own leadership acknowledging his contributions. The press began to murmur. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. Langston paused, then said, without bitterness, that the same institution that now claimed it had no record of his appointments had once called him visionary, had once asked for his insight, had once considered partnering with his firm on future financial inclusion programs. And then, he said, they saw him in person. And everything changed. The silence that followed was heavy, not because he had shouted, but because every fact stood irrefutable. Every word grounded in documented truth, and the impact was no longer just personal. It had become institutional. The following morning, Wexley Federal's website quietly removed multiple photos and reshuffled leadership bios. By afternoon, an internal memo was leaked, revealing that the board of directors had launched an independent inquiry into branch-level conduct and client engagement protocols. Langston did not return to the podium. He did not gloat. He stood once again on the sidewalk, briefcase in hand, silent but no longer alone. Public support grew louder. Community coalitions called for reform. Former employees reached out privately to confirm patterns, to share their own stories of seeing certain clients ignored or mishandled. An internal whistleblower disclosed that Langston's file had been tagged with vague caution notes shortly after his first visit, notes without justification, added after closed-door conversations between upper management. National outlets picked up the story. Opinion pieces followed. A financial watchdog group launched a formal review of Wexley Federal's broader policies. But for Langston, the turning point was not the outrage. It was the acknowledgement. For the first time, his full identity had been brought into the light. Not just his name or his work, but the totality of who he was, what he represented, and why the institution had tried so hard to deny him access. He had become too much for their system to process, not because he was disruptive, but because he defied their assumptions of who could belong, who could lead, and who deserved respect. That afternoon, Langston received a private message from a senior executive at another financial institution, offering a meeting and expressing regret that it had taken a public reckoning for the industry to confront its own blind spots. Langston replied politely that he would consider the invitation, but that he was not interested in symbolic gestures or press-driven apologies. He wanted systemic change. He wanted accountability. He wanted the truth to matter more than optics. An internal email leak confirmed that Grayson Dale had indeed received Langston's materials prior to his first visit, that he had flagged the file with unspecified caution notes, and that he had discussed the client with senior staff in language that was professional on the surface, but carried unmistakable undertones of suspicion and bias. The memo included phrasing like heightened sensitivity and discretion advised, terms that in context meant nothing and everything, giving staff permission to treat Langston as a problem before he had even arrived. The memo was dated 4 days before Langston's first visit. Wexley Federal's board of directors convened an emergency meeting, and within 24 hours, Grayson Dale was placed on administrative leave, not out of moral clarity but necessity, as the bank stock price dipped under the weight of public doubt and media coverage. Within a week, a class action lawsuit was filed by a coalition of clients who claimed to have experienced similar mistreatment, each one presenting documents and timelines that echoed Langston's journey with frightening accuracy. Financial blogs tracked the collapse of public trust in real time, with investors urging divestment from the institution and ethics watchdogs calling for deeper investigations. One of the most influential mutual funds in the nation, managing over $2 billion in assets, announced it would sever all ties with Wexley Federal, citing the institution's failure to align with its stated values of equity and inclusion. The announcement was swift, unemotional, and final. Within hours, the story broke across every major financial news outlet. The headline was blunt: Fund severs $2.7 billion in assets from Wexley over client discrimination. Langston read the article without triumph. He read it with clarity. He understood the gravity of what had been set in motion, not as a personal victory, but as a necessary shift, the result of countless moments of indignity finally counted, recorded, and revealed. Calls came from national civil rights organizations, requests for interviews, invitations to panels and conferences, but Langston declined most of them, not because he lacked interest, but because the work was not done, the truth not fully acknowledged, the transformation not yet complete. Meanwhile, Wexley's leadership scrambled to contain the fallout, announcing reforms, restructuring teams, rebranding internal policies. But the gestures landed flat, read as reactive and insincere, as though they had been crafted more to salvage public image than to address the rot beneath the surface. Community members rallied around Langston's presence, establishing a formal coalition advocating for transparent financial practices and equal client engagement, using his story as a model for exposing systemic exclusion through precision and patience. The coalition drafted a client bill of rights and began submitting it to other regional banks, demanding adoption and accountability. Langston was asked to serve as its advisor. He accepted on one condition: that the work not begin with publicity but with policy, that real change required more than cameras. Back inside Wexley Federal, the mood shifted from discomfort to fear. Staff who had once mocked Langston now avoided speaking his name. Some asked to be transferred. Others quietly submitted resignations. Regional leadership called in crisis consultants, but morale was fractured. The once proud lobby now stood half empty during business hours, blinds partially closed, conversations hushed. Clients withdrew funds. Reviews plummeted. Anonymous surveys revealed internal anxiety, a recognition that what had once been accepted behavior now carried visible consequence. And through it all, Langston kept showing up, not to gloat, not to bask in the collapse, but to hold presence. He stood in the same place as always, now joined by rotating volunteers, young professionals, retirees, community advocates, all of them drawn not to a protest, but to a posture. A man who had proven that being underestimated was not a limitation, but a weapon, that silence could be strategy, and that dignity, once stripped, could be reclaimed in public, in daylight, without apology. On the 30th day of his presence, the institution finally reached out directly, not with platitudes, but with an invitation to meet with the board, to review the findings of the internal investigation, to discuss systemic change with those at the highest level. Langston accepted, but on his terms. The meeting would be documented, the agenda published, the outcomes made public. He walked into the building not as a client, but as a force of accountability. In the months that followed the reckoning at Wexley Federal, the institution underwent a transformation unlike anything in its long and previously unchallenged history, not because it wanted to change, but because it had to, because the pressure exerted by truth and consequence had become impossible to deflect or contain, and the system that once operated in quiet complicity with bias was now under a microscope, held steady by the very man it had tried to erase. Langston Morrow, once relegated to a corner chair near a janitor's closet, now stood at the table where institutional policy was being rewritten, not as a token or a public relations figure, but as a principal voice in a new movement for transparency, dignity, and real accountability in financial access. His timeline, once a document of personal suffering, had become the blueprint for reform, studied by other banks, used in conferences, taught in training seminars, and replicated by organizations seeking to ensure that clients were treated not according to assumptions, but according to fact. Wexley Federal implemented a mandatory audit system, one that tracked every client engagement and compared it to internal flags, response times, and patterns of treatment, all designed to identify the subtle markers of exclusion that had once gone unchecked. New policies required transparency in appointment scheduling, written justifications for cancellations, and an open record of client service ratings that could not be hidden behind vague language. But even as the systems changed, the deeper shift happened in people, beginning with those who had once upheld the old order without question. The receptionist, who had first ignored Langston, requested a transfer to community outreach, admitting in private meetings that he had followed unspoken signals and assumed them to be justified, never realizing how his small actions contributed to a much larger harm. He apologized not with words alone, but with a year of service in underbanked neighborhoods, assisting in financial literacy programs that Langston helped design. The teller who had bypassed Langston during the bottled water round eventually approached him at a community forum, speaking candidly about how she had dismissed the moment at the time, thinking only of her tasks, never pausing to consider how her silence had reinforced someone's marginalization. She now taught inclusivity workshops for new employees, using Langston's story as the central case study. Even Graysondale, who had been terminated and publicly criticized, requested a meeting with Langston months later, not to ask for reinstatement or to defend his actions, but to understand what had happened, to confront the weight of his choices, and to begin the long work of changing the patterns within himself that had allowed those choices to feel acceptable in the first place. Langston agreed to the meeting, not because he sought revenge or needed an apology, but because transformation required confrontation, and healing could not exist without acknowledgement. They sat across from one another in a small neutral office, both men older than when they had first met, both altered by the journey between then and now. Grayson admitted that he had judged Langston from the moment he saw him, that he had doubted the legitimacy of his proposal not based on merit, but on the discomfort that Langston's presence triggered in his worldview. Langston listened, then spoke not with bitterness but with clarity, reminding Grayson that discomfort is not an excuse for exclusion, and that leadership is not measured by authority, but by the courage to face one's own blind spots. Grayson left that meeting without a job title, but with a path forward, one he would have to walk with humility and action. Outside the institution, Langston's impact continued to ripple. The community coalition he advised became a national network, linking professionals, advocates, and clients across industries to document exclusion and push for change. They developed an app that allowed clients to anonymously rate financial service experiences, highlighting patterns of mistreatment and providing data for public accountability. The model was adopted by 5 regional banks within the year. At universities, Langston lectured not as a guest speaker, but as a featured faculty member in programs that explored ethics, economics, and equity. He mentored students, encouraged young professionals to question systems, and taught them how to challenge injustice without losing dignity. His presence in those classrooms became symbolic, not of perfection, but of persistence. He reminded them that change is not born in outrage alone, but in the quiet accumulation of truth, carried forward by people who refuse to be reduced. Over time, the street where Langston had once stood alone became a small public square, unofficially named Morrow Plaza by local residents. A bronze plaque was placed at the edge of the sidewalk, not to glorify a man, but to commemorate a moment when presence defeated erasure. It read simply, "Here stood someone who would not be moved." Langston visited it sometimes, always quietly, sometimes with community members, sometimes alone, never with fanfare, always with the understanding that the legacy of resistance is not in the story's visibility, but in the shift it creates beneath the surface of things. On the 1-year anniversary of his first denied appointment, Wexley Federal held an open house event, not to celebrate the institution, but to acknowledge the transformation born from its failure. Langston was invited to speak. He accepted. He stood in the same lobby where he had once been invisible and addressed a crowd of employees, clients, journalists, and board members. He spoke not of victory, but of vigilance. He reminded them that inclusion is not a box to be checked, but a culture to be maintained. He said that justice is not about one man being seen, but about ensuring that no one is dismissed for reasons no one will say aloud. He finished by saying that silence, once used to hide harm, can be reclaimed to hold power, and that presence, when held long enough, changes the shape of the space around it. The room stood silent in response, not in avoidance, but in reverence. Later that evening, Langston walked through the city streets under a cool sky, his briefcase still in hand, though now worn from use, its corners softened from the weight of work well done. He passed by banks and offices, cafes and bookstores, and knew that his story, once confined to rejection, now lived in the air of those spaces. It lived in new policies, in changed minds, in the quiet resolve of people who had found in his silence a model for their own voice. And as he walked past Wexley Federal one last time that night, he paused not to glare or reminisce, but to reflect. The building still stood, still operated, still served clients. But it no longer held power over him. It no longer had the final word. Because the final word belonged to the truth he had carried with him through every dismissal, every humiliation, every moment they tried to look through him instead of at him. That truth now lived outside their walls, written into a movement, carried forward by many, and built on the simple, unshakable message that dignity does not need permission. The end. If you've been moved by Langston's story and the journey toward justice, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps bring more of these powerful stories to life. Let us know in the comments what you think about the twists in the plot, what moments hit the hardest, and which parts you didn't see coming. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.